from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I am pleased to welcome you to a two-week series on a very, very important topic. We're going to be discussing the possibility of deregulation or restructuring of hydroelectrical power in this country. Some of our viewers, I'm sure, are aware of the debate that's taking place in Congress concerning potential legislation on this very important subject. In addition to the debate that's taking place there, it has caused the states of our country to take a look at what they're going to do and if they may move even before the possibility of action in Congress. We're bringing the program to you today from our studios here at North Idaho College, and we want to discuss what is developing in the state of Idaho, although I would mention to the viewers in other states that this certainly is a regional question and a national question. I'm sure you'll find our program of interest in your state also. The governor of our state, Phil Batt, in May of this year, 1997, set up what was called the Council on Hydroelectric and River Resources. And under that council are 4 subcommittees, and we're very fortunate to have in our studios and on our campus for a public forum on this day one of those committees. It is called the Consumer and Public Purposes Subcommittee. We have most of the members of that committee with us this week and next week on this program to discuss what Idaho might do, and we commend the governor of our state for taking this action to study what's going on. One more point would be that the first state to act on this issue with the developments going on nationally has been the state of New Hampshire. On the first program, I welcome 4 guests that are on this subcommittee. First of all is Chris BRAY, who is from Boise, and he's an attorney, and he's chairing the subcommittee. Chris, thank you for bringing your colleagues with you and discussing this important issue today.
You're welcome, Tony. Thank you.
And next to him is another member from North Idaho, my friend, Lori Barnes. We worked together on a number of projects and on this program before. She is a business consultant and also is on the committee, and she is from Hayden, Idaho. Welcome, Lori.
Thanks.
And next to her is Anna SCHACHTELL, who is also from Boise. She is a community activist. And Anna, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for coming all the way to Coeur d'Alene for this public forum.
Thank you for having me.
And next to me is Amy Fisher, who is a student at Boise State University, and she is from Mountain Home, and she is representing students on the committee. And Amy, it's a pleasure to have you on our program.
Thanks for having me here.
Chris, may I start with you on what I'd like to introduce to our viewers as one of the most complex subjects I've had. I guess I'd call it the privilege of discussing on this program. And may I say that we're taping this on September the 29th, and it'll air in November, and so a lot will maybe happen before then. But would you start the program by explaining to us what the charge was from the governor, and what are the purposes of this subcommittee and others that are working on this important issue in Idaho as they are in other states?
Tony, thank you. I'd be happy to. And I want to tell you it's a real privilege for us to be here because one of the needs that the governor has recognized is to be aware that there's a regional, not just an Idaho, awareness of the potential for retail sale of electricity. That means, frankly, that there's a political decision to be made many times with regard to economic issues. Political issues in this case means how will the Northwest be able to respond to potential federal legislation? And if we don't have a regional consensus about where we're going to go, how we're going to get there, then Idaho, with 2 senators and 2 representatives, won't have much of a political voice in Congress. Likewise, we think if we have both the states of Washington and Oregon together, not only do we have their congressional and senatorial numbers, but we have a region. And it's that context, or within that context, I shall say, that the governor has made this appointment. What the governor has also done is to appoint a council. That council is headed by former Senator Jim McClure. In that council, there are 3 members of state departments. There are also 4 subcommittees. Of those 4 subcommittees, one is the Hydropower Relicensing Committee, another is the Hydroelectric Restructuring Committee, Another is the River Governance Committee, and then our committee, the Consumer and Public Purposes. The reason for 4 committees rather than one giant committee is that the governor wants to know what individual issues can be discussed by different experts. He is potentially accepting an overlap or even a diversity of opinion in those 4 committees. Once the committees, though, do meet, and it's our responsibility to provide a report to Senator McClure's council by the end of October. So by November the 1st, our committee will meet and have a formal report to Senator McClure's council. From that, each subcommittee member and the council members will meet through the month of November and December to make final recommendations to the governor on this very critical issue. It will affect all of us in all the years to come.
Thank you. That's very, very clear. And let me follow up with a question. As our viewers would know, over the years, over many decades, each state has had a utility commission, and this has been a regulated industry, and actually, in many cases, a monopoly providing the electricity to homes and industry and to everyone. It affects all the economy. And that was done, of course, a long time ago because of how expensive it was to put the whole system together. Would you go further to explain one of the, I think is the heart of this question is what we might anticipate Congress doing, that is Congress might mandate through legislation, which they would probably have the power to do under areas like the Commerce Clause, to states that you're going to deregulate or you're going to do this or that, or they might yield to the states, to each state to craft somewhat different legislation concerning what you have now and how you change that. That's just my introduction to the question of saying, are there different options that may come out of this debate, both in relation to states and the national government?
Tony, there are significantly different options, and we don't know which is going to come forth. There is a congressman, Congressman Schaefer, who in the House is pushing hard for legislation that would force retail sales of electricity.
Can I interject there to say, would you share to viewers like myself who are very uninformed on this question, what you mean with the difference between where you have monopoly and regulated and versus retail sale of power?
Yes. Right now, Idaho has probably the lowest cost energy, average cost energy of any state in the nation, even though there is a monopoly. You think of a monopoly as holding prices and being able to charge whatever they wish to charge. In Idaho and throughout the country, public utilities commissions have been created to allow for there to be a monopoly, but to say that there can only be a reasonable rate of return based on certain expenses. And so for the guarantee of a monopoly, the utilities must charge a certain price and only within a certain price range, and when they wish to change those prices, they must return to the Public Utility Commission for analysis and for the PUC then to make a decision.
And there can be public hearings with people that have different interests giving input?
Absolutely, and ultimately, if there's a disagreement, it can be litigated in the courts. But we have a very strong system of give and take between the PUC in Idaho and private and public utilities, so that that's not happened in many years. The next part of your question, I think, would be why there is a change. Well, there have been certain states, predominantly those in the East Coast and some on the West Coast, like California. But let's go to New Hampshire, where the rates are maybe 4 times what they are in Idaho. And they are 4 times as high because they don't have hydroelectric power, because they've tried to use nuclear energy and failed, and because they have to use coal-fired energy, which is very expensive there. Their costs are simply going to be higher than they will be in Idaho.
And the capital investment's been so high that it's caused prices to go up.
Absolutely. What those states have been able to bring to bear is certain pressure in Congress to say, we want to reduce our costs. Maybe another way of saying that is there are certain industries in those states who are tired of paying the high cost, who believe if there is electricity on a market, a spot market, so to speak, just like a futures market, that they can buy it like they can buy grain or potatoes, and thus reduce their costs. And in fact, that's possible. There's obviously lower cost electricity in Idaho than there is in New Hampshire. Now, Congress so far has recognized that only the states individually have the right to determine their own electric rates. This Congressman Schaefer is seeking to push a bill through that would change the entire landscape. We are fortunate to have Congressman Crapo, who is the co-chair to that committee, or the vice chair, so Idaho knows what's happening at that committee.
For our viewers outside, he is a congressman from eastern Idaho.
Yes, and it's really very important that we have that current information. We don't have, again, the political clout that numbers or seniority have, but we do have the information. What that then brings us to is there an advantage to a retail sale, meaning simply the sale of electricity to a large customer like the Simplot company, like Hewlett-Packard, like FMC. FMC, for instance, purchases probably 30% of the load of Idaho Power. Now, that's a very predominant customer. They're going to want to say, we want a special rate for our volume and for our size. And if you don't come to us, can we go someplace else? Right now, they can't go to anybody else. They have to receive their electricity under Idaho state rates.
Okay, thank you. Lori, if we can go to you. You and I had a little discussion when you were appointed to this committee recently, and we were talking about restructuring, and Chris has done a wonderful job of laying out some issues. Would you share with us your view as a member of the committee on restructuring of hydroelectric facilities and make a distinction between that and in other words, I take that to mean that those options are somewhat different than if we'd have just a total mandate of deregulation. Would you share with us what your view is of what this may mean in this committee and to this state?
Yeah, let me take the second part, what it means more to the committee. I think Chris did a great job giving an overview. My understanding that as a citizen on this committee, you know, what our task is, because we are not the experts on this subject. We were put on the committee as a citizen's point of view, what's going on. What we need to do is look at the current status quo. We have a lot of public purposes that we as citizens enjoy. Now, if we have restructuring, how will that impact us? Will our rates go up? Will our rates go down? Are we still going to receive some of the public purposes that are now provided by the utilities, such as the low-income energy assistance, such as the demand-side management, which is trying to reduce the demand of electricity, and conservation efforts? So I think what we're trying to do is figure out, if it happens, like Chris talked about, how does it impact us? And so those are the type of things we're looking at, the public purposes.
There's a real diversity on this committee, and that's been done very conscientiously.
Yeah.
And what do you see, Lori, as the different interests that will be possibly affected, but depending on what the outcome is? You've identified some, but there's a lot of different users of the power and all over the United States, including the state. Could you identify a little more for us in detail some of those and how they may come out of this possibly? I know you're not here today to make recommendations. I'm very clear of that. But how that could affect different groups.
Yeah, and actually that's what you're doing, asking us questions. That's what we're doing. We're asking questions. And yes, you're right, there are different groups. If there is restructuring, how does it impact the big business, the one that uses a lot of utility? How does it impact the smaller one? And when we were asked those questions, some people will tell you that it's going to benefit the larger user and that the smaller user are going to see their rates go up. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. So those are the things that we're looking at. And then again, how is it going to impact the individual citizen? So again, those are the things that we're looking at. So when you look at the diversity and the different impacts, there's a broad base there.
So in addition to the very large users, and Chris identified one, and of course those large users are important and they create a lot of jobs and so forth. But then we have small businesses, and they can be very much affected by that, and then the homeowner and
Everyone
is somehow affected by this issue. That's why I want to do the program.
Yeah.
Anna, may I turn to you? You certainly are very deeply involved in your community in Boise, and I introduced you as a community activist. And what do you see as your role, and what are you trying to find out? And again, I don't want to put you on the spot of saying, here is what my recommendation is to the committee, because we're doing this show before you have two of the hearings, or the public forums. But how would you add to what Lori has said about the possible impact on different groups?
Well, as you know, the third, I would say, of the Hispanic population in the state of Idaho lives under the federal poverty line. And so I'm very concerned, about the lower income population. I think we need to make sure that there are some safeguards established, as the regulation takes place, to make sure, like Lori says, that every group is protected and guaranteed affordable rates in Idaho.
So I think I hear from all of you what you're saying is that, that as there's possible legislation drafted, that it can take different approaches, but one of the things that could wind up in the legislation is some recognition that everyone going into the marketplace, if it is retail, may not have the same advantage, and that legislation might need to recognize that to protect those who maybe can less afford and also have less bargaining power.
Exactly.
It kind of reminds me of a large supermarket versus a mom and pop's grocery store. The large supermarket can buy in volume and therefore get it cheaper.
Well, part of it also, Tony, is that those things are already being paid for. We're paying for them in our bills. We just don't know it. It's all in there in the bundled cost. And so when competition comes in, and now everybody's trying to get in there for a little bit less and a little bit less, there's a concern that some of those public purposes might be dropped off. So the legislation that we would be looking at is there a way to decide what programs are beneficial, which ones should be kept? If they're kept, who pays for them? How do you pay for them? The discussion right now is a 3% surcharge, so to speak, on the retail revenue from utilities, and then put that money back in to continue these so that we make sure that it does stay both affordable and reliable. Those are the two key issues.
And we're going to get into that in the next show on more detail of some of those issues, but that really makes it helpful. Chris?
Tony, in response to your question about the diversity on the committee, let me tell you that Governor Batt reviewed every member's background on this committee before they were chosen. He did so specifically wanting to make sure that people who were normal, ordinary citizens could go out and seek information for him. He was receiving information from lobbyists from every other industry, but he wasn't receiving information from individual citizens. And he wasn't receiving information from the small business person. And so that's one of the focal points of this committee, to gather that information for him, sort of to be his eyes and ears in that sense. I would also tell you that there are some persons, for instance, like Amy and her representing students. Students, frankly, are a group that are going to be making decisions for this state for the next 20 years. We need them to be involved. We need, frankly, everyone to be involved on this particular issue.
Thank you. Amy, I'm going to turn to you because Amy and I were talking before the program, and I commend her. She's been out surveying students at Boise State University. And Amy, would you share with our viewers what some of those challenges that lie ahead for you? And I suspect the challenge that you found is not confined to college campuses, but again, your chair, Chris Bray, has indicated that certainly there is a lack of awareness. I myself try to stay in tune to a lot of issues, and this one is one that I find overwhelming and complex. Tell us what you found in your survey.
Well, I noticed that when I go to school and I bring this issue up, since I've been chosen as a committee member, that rarely anybody is aware of what's going on. I think that the students get trapped in their everyday life studying, go to class studying. They don't receive the newspaper. They don't have time to watch the news on television. And they're simply unaware of the fact that this is going on. And as an example, I was at my work. I'm a lifeguard at the YMCA, and one of my fellow co-workers, I asked them what they thought, and they thought it was about deregulating the president's power as on part of the legislature. And so I told them, what it was about, and so they were more aware of it. And they were in the dorms, and they don't pay their electric bill, and I think that has a large part to do with it also. I have an apartment right next to BSU, and I'm aware of the rate of electricity and how much it costs utilities and everything. So I think a large part of the unawareness of the students is that they're trapped in that little place and they're doing their own little thing in their world, and it's hard to see.
So really, you made a real good point. If they're young and they were at home and their parents paid the utility bills, they didn't see them. Now they're in a dorm and it's paid, they may not yet have had exposure to the economic impact to them personally. I also asked you in our earlier discussion, you really interested me with this. As one of the members of the committee, and again your chair has elaborated upon this, how does one, not only here in Idaho but around the country, how does one get everyone's attention before these final decisions are made?
Well, around campus the main thing is flyers, pin up flyers everywhere. Well, until I was chosen by Chris, or he recommended me, I was unaware also of what was going on. And it seems to me that people need to be chosen or picked out of a group for, say, a president of the campus, the student president, could somehow bring it to the inside of the students somehow. Flyers, everyone's reading flyers. So I don't know how to get the attention of the students besides pinpointing them out.
Let me say one thing, then go back to your chair. You sparked an interest with that comment. Again, it's one thing the committee might consider, and I'm not here to make the recommendations for you, but organizations all over this state and other states have officers, and that might be a good way to share something about this through many, many organizations. But Chris, you would like to respond?
That's a very good point.
It is, isn't it? About what Amy just really sparked my interest in how
Yes.
to try to deal with it.
I would say, too, that the legislature last year passed a bill that required the various utilities to unbundle their costs. Now, that's a term that's been used, and Laurie has spoken to that. Basically, it means separating the cost of electricity from the cost of a program to develop energy or to provide low-income weatherization or some other non-energy cost, so that people will be able to see what is an energy cost and what is not. The assumption that in doing that we will have better information, there will be more reason to scrutinize, and you'll see what the effect is. It's really interesting, and I hope everyone will watch what Washington Water Power has done. They, in fact, have tried this, then found a survey. They surveyed their customers who said, yes, we are willing to pay extra for conservation. We are willing to pay extra for energy renewal. So the assumption by some that the competitive marketplace does not allow for non-electrical costs may not hold true, at least in the Northwest.
Chris, I'd like to follow up on that with two questions, and one is, do you anticipate that one of the possibilities, as I hear you say that, about one particular industry in one state under the Utility Commission and some creative ideas that they've had, will some states be ahead in this process and become models? And is that a possibility where we're headed? Some states will move fast, and others. New Hampshire's moving fast. Now there's going to be economic competition and interests that are different from state to state, but what is the possibility of that happening?
Models like beauty are in the eye of the beholder.
And who it helps and who it hurts.
That's right. Where you stand depends on perhaps where you sit. There's that question too, that old aphorism. What I would say is that yes, there are other states who, in different circumstances, are ahead of us. The committee will be asking questions of, at its forums, should we take examples of people who have deregulated and forge ahead, or should we watch and be cautious and see what is the production of those examples? I think anytime you watch what New Hampshire does or California does or Montana does without knowing the context in which they pass their legislation, then we are at risk by applying it to Idaho. One thing that Idaho has always taken pride in is being itself, making its own decisions, And I think we can, and we can do it in a responsible way, and that's what we expect people are going to demand of us, actually.
Lori?
Could I add to that also? It's not necessarily going to be individual states. We may look at some sort of a regional concept, and in fact that probably will be something that needs to be considered because we are in such close proximity, and in fact there have already been some regional studies that we're looking at.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Anna?
I'd like to add something. We also need to look at other utilities for samples, like the gas company or the gas utility, and also the telephone utility. We need to look at those and see how it has worked for them, what competition has brought.
We have something really not quite unique because there's TVA in the South, but Bonneville, which has really had a major role to play in our hydroelectric questions here in the Northwest. And I know this is in another arena, but there's been some serious discussions since the 1980s to sell that public utility or that producer, Bonneville, and it will affect, if that happens, of course, the whole structure here and the rates. And so, Lori, in relation to what you're saying, does that make it even more crucial that we look at regional issues in case that does come down the pike?
We can't work in a vacuum. We're all interconnected with each other, and I think that regional approach is going to be critical to finding the right solution.
Chris, would you like to elaborate on that? We're down to 2 minutes left, and we'll pick up on some of these specific questions next week, but are you hopeful that there'll be cooperation around the region?
Very much so, Tony, though, again, there are differences between Washington and Oregon and Idaho. There was a comprehensive review that was created after a year's study when 2 members from each of the states, appointed by their respective governors, met and had proper staffing to study these issues. They came out with a review. A part of that comprehensive review listed several public purposes. One of those was to say, in order to protect universal service, in order to protect the rural Idahoan, in order to protect those people who cannot afford an increase in rates, we will charge a 3% surcharge on the user.
I have to interrupt at that point, but that brings our audience back next week. I'm sure we'll pick up on this, ladies and gentlemen. We've had several members with us today from Idaho from the Consumer and Public Purposes Subcommittee studying hydroelectric power. We've talked about the structure this week and what might be the options. Next week, be with us when we discuss very specific issues of what could happen and what are some of the complexities of this question. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We're pleased to be with you for our second week of a 2-week series discussing regulation compared with deregulation of hydroelectric facilities in this country. We often call it the restructuring of the hydroelectric facilities. As we said to you last week, Congress has had a number of bills introduced, and they are discussing whether or not we should go to some form of deregulation all over the country and have retail sale of hydroelectric facilities and the consumption of hydroelectric power. It's a very, very important question, and we're very pleased to be back here again this week, and we're very fortunate to have members of a committee with us. We have the chair back and some new members this week. I should point out to our viewers from outside of Idaho that Idaho Governor Phil Batt in May of this year appointed what was called the Council on Hydroelectric and River Resources. There are 4 subcommittees, and one of those is the Consumer and Public Purposes Subcommittee. And on the date of the taping of this program, September the 29th, 1997, they have been very good to come to our community for a public forum as they're holding those across Idaho. And we are very, very pleased to have them here to discuss a follow-up from last week. Last week we talked pretty much about the structure of what state public utility commissions do and the regulation system it is set up and how that might change and what the role of Congress is. This time we want to get into some of the exact issues of how that can affect all people and the use of electricity. I welcome to the program, first of all, back from last week, Chris BRAY, who is the chair of this committee. He's from Boise, he's an attorney, and he's a mediator. Chris, welcome back. We really enjoyed the program last week. You and your other members of the committee were most informative.
Thank you, Tony. We appreciate the chance to be here.
I'm very pleased to also welcome to the program from that committee this week SHEILA Adams. She's from Burley, Idaho, and she's in the real estate business. And SHEILA, it's a pleasure to meet you and to have you here to discuss this important issue.
Thank you for inviting me.
And next to her is Jerry Meyers, who is from Lewiston, Idaho, and he is with Potlatch Corporation, a manager of energy services, and he will have a lot to say to us today about the role of states and the federal government in relation to particularly large consumers of industry and how that distinguishes from others. And Jerry, welcome to the program.
Good to be here, Tony.
And we're also very pleased to have next to me is Carolyn Ryan. She is from the city of Boise. She is a small business owner, and she too will speak to some of those issues and what happens to rate changes and how it affects different businesses. Carolyn, it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
And last, but certainly not least, we're very pleased to have Ken Robinette, who is from Twin Falls. He is an administrator of community action programs, and he too will discuss how some of these issues affect those he serves and others in society. Ken, welcome to the program. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Tony. It's nice to be here.
Chris, let's start again with you this week. I have some statistics with me that I think are of importance to the magnitude of this issue. One statistic that I saw was that about $210 billion is spent a year in the United States for electric power business consumption and all forms of consumption. That's a lot of money in our economy. And we know that as we look around the country, one of the things that probably has brought this issue to the forefront has been the difference in rates. Each state is setting those rates, and power is produced in different ways in different states. Some are using hydroelectric, others are using more nuclear power plants and coal generated. Would you take a few minutes to see into this question and how your committee is working on why some rates are higher, some are lower, and what the outcome possibly could be depending on how we deal with this in states and the nation?
Tony, thank you. The committee is having public forums. We will have had two, both in Boise and then in Coeur d'Alene, and then one more, the third one in Pocatello by the time this program airs. And our role really is to try to ask the kinds of questions that you're giving us the chance to pose now to your viewers. In terms of the statistics, there's no question that the electric power industry is a tremendously large one. The generation of power, whether it's gas or electric, is an essential in our lives. And I think that goes to the core of an inquiry. When something is essential to your livelihood, must the state continue to have some oversight to see that the essentials are met versus some other area of commerce that one might say is not essential? And by an example, the telephone is nice, the telephone is convenient, and the telephone for most of us is a given. But if the telephone doesn't work in December, you don't freeze to death. If the electricity or the gas doesn't work in December, you freeze to death. Now that's a pretty graphic example, but I do think it's important to show what states, and particularly the Idaho Public Utilities Commission and the governor, are saying. We want to be sure that when we seek any change in the law, that it's done cautiously, it's done responsibly, to the benefit of all Idaho citizens, not just a few.
Would you follow up on that by indicating in my second part of the question why rates do vary greatly? You mentioned briefly on the last program that there's a tremendous difference depending on what region of the country that you live in, first of all, and even in the state in which you live.
Yes, Tony, in Idaho, we have the wonderful water resource from rivers that gives us hydroelectric power.
And it's cheaper than some of the other forms.
It is, because once the dams were created several years ago, there's a certain fixed cost in the dam, but the generation of water thereafter is not like coal that you have to buy every year. It's not like nuclear power that has a cost. And frankly, nuclear power primarily throughout the rest of the country has proven not to be an economically viable resource or a safe resource.
And to build that facility is much more expensive.
Absolutely. What Idaho has been able to do is to enjoy that lower rate, whereas, let's say, New Hampshire, which doesn't have rivers that can create hydroelectric power, has to rely upon coal or some other generation source. And as a result, there or in large states, for instance, California or New York, where they have huge populations, and thus they have to generate huge amounts of electricity or power, then their costs to create that consumption is a real factor in their total bill. Here, our costs are just not that large. What we are concerned about is with any deregulation of electricity, there will be could there be a rising of low rates? Could there be a lowering of high rates? Is Idaho going to be caught in the middle, and why would we want to?
All of you trigger my thinking, and that's why I enjoy the program. In other words, if some states have been fortunate enough to have these natural resources, another issue that's come up in the past is the great water in the Northwest and the hungry Southwest without water, how you share resources. And so if we do some kind of national policy, those who either had to or decided to opt for a more expensive production process could affect those who used a different system, could it not, from what you've been saying?
There's no question about it. And though it sounds reasonable to say we all ought to be paying about average, if that means that costs in Idaho rise significantly, then that common ground in electric costs ought to be scrutinized very highly. For one of the reasons, electricity is part of an economic package. Transporting goods from Lewiston, where Potlatch is, through the Columbia River, it costs a certain amount of money to do that, even on barges. Whereas the people in Portland who are producing grain or timber, they don't have that transportation cost. Mm-hmm. The people in the Southwest, in Arizona, have freeways that connect them with all of the rest of California or Texas. We don't have a freeway that connects the North and the South.
So the really unique difference is that...
Very different, and they need to be contemplated before any changes occur.
That's really an excellent point. SHEILA, may I go to you now? I want to ask you a question about the real estate industry, and all I know that, what little I know about it, that as you're selling homes or apartments, wherever it may be, that one of the things that becomes very much involved in that process is that potential homeowners ask you about what the mortgage is going to be and those kind of things, but what are the utility rates and so forth. And as a member of this committee, you'll be very valuable in that process. How do you look at this whole question as it relates to a very big industry, a very important one, business, all over the country, and Idaho being an example where there's been a lot of growth in recent years?
Well, if we're looking at it from the standpoint of a buyer asking about being able to compare utility rates, we're very fortunate anywhere in Idaho because, as we've all said before, we already have the opportunity to have the lowest rates in the nation, and within southern Idaho we have so many rural cooperatives. For example, in the Minnecaja area where I live, there are 12 local rural cooperatives from which to choose, so we have the lowest rates even within the state. That's important for a consumer who's a home buying consumer. I think what we're looking at, the effect being of deregulation, or one of the possible effects being, is that the people who are looking at building, and this comes into affordable housing, is that if the developer is not able to develop a lot, in other words, bring power into it at a relatively viable cost for them to develop that lot, they either won't do it, so we then would be facing a housing shortage, or they're going to pass it on to the home buying consumer at higher building and higher purchase prices. You mentioned the sale of homes and apartments, but we also deal in the same sale of agricultural properties, and that's one of the main concerns that we have, is that we're an area that is so dependent on agriculture, and the people who are farming, any 1% rate in the kilowatt hour charge affects drastically their bottom line to the tune of being able to farm or not.
To buy it and then to produce. One other question before I go to Jerry, and I also think about the senior citizens who have very fixed income now, and a lot of them have not been able to save like they wish, and they're in a home and they're marginal being able to stay in that home. Could this also affect those individuals?
It could affect them, I think, more on the side of the funds that would be available for conservation programs or energy assistance programs, because if those are cut back or left to individual funding, I think that we would see those markedly affected and probably removed.
Jerry, you and I talked before the program, and you have something really important to say, I believe, about, for our viewers, clearing up how this whole operates when we talk about something called public-owned utilities and investor-owned utilities in municipal city. Would you just take that and run with that question and talk about, as we try to decide this important question, how all of these ownerships play in this process and identifying them?
Sure. As was mentioned in last week's program, there are basically a couple of what we call investor-owned utilities, and these folks are regulated by the state utility commissions, or the Washington, in the case of Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commission, who set the rates, who determine if the fees charged and the investments are prudent, et cetera, and develop any rate base. But also, as was just mentioned, in the Northwest there are some 120 or 130 separate individual, what we call privately owned utilities, your electric co-ops, some of the rural areas that form co-ops because, quite frankly, it wasn't cost feasible for the larger investor-owned utilities to form. Some of your cities, Seattle being the largest single example, Seattle City Light is what we call a municipal utility. All of these privately owned utilities are regulated not by a utility commission, but by a separate board and commission. In the case of Seattle City Light, of course, it would be the City Council in Seattle. Kootenai County, or Kootenai Electric Cooperative, has their own board elected by the membership, much like a co-op bank would have. And these folks are concerned about, for them, not deregulation, but more regulation, the loss of what they call local governance. And so there are a couple different forces at work here. Right now, the states don't regulate these private utilities. They do regulate the investor-owned utilities. So in one case, we're talking about the restructuring or less regulation for the investor-owns, and perhaps more or new regulation of some sort for the privately owned co-ops.
This is really a significant point to get out, and I just wasn't aware of that. So when we talk about the retail market and deregulating, that there's actually a component within the industry that might be going in the reverse.
Right. And if you look at it, we hear a lot about aggregation. How can the small individual homeowner get their electricity, go out and bargain the way a Potlatch could, or the way a Simplot could, or the way a university could? The large customers are easy for suppliers. You got one bill, you send it one place, they know how to bargain, they buy large quantities of stuff, and they pay their bills. Piece of cake. Now you start talking about supplying 0.5 megawatt to her house, 2 megawatts to their house. You know, Chris's law office may use 3/4 megawatt. A lot of paperwork, a lot of accounting. So we talk about aggregators, where Joe's Storm Door and Electrical Aggregation Company says, gee, we'd like to sign up your whole block and buy power. Well, literally, co-ops were the first aggregators. They took the customers that weren't attractive, etc., and aggregated them. And now, as you pointed out so aptly, it may be going 180 around from that.
That is really helpful. Carolyn, if I can come to you, certainly you're a person of small business, very interested in this question, as our other guests are. And one of the things that I'd like to share with you, some studies I did, is that if it does become a nationwide policy, in effect, there are some places in the United States where the power rates will probably go down on average 15, 20%. Others, they may go up 25%. It would seem to me, as someone who's not very informed on economic matters, that would affect the economy, that if rates become lower, that you could recruit more business and more economic prosperity, but also an area where there'd be a great raise in prices could affect, in a negative way, a recession. Would you address this question, please?
Yes, I think I'd have to start by recognizing that as a small business person, I can bring myself down to being an individual person. And when I do that, I went out and I took a kind of a poll with people. And I said, what if you could participate in the lowering of your energy bill? And I said, would you participate? Would you answer me honestly? Would you take part in that? And more people than not said that they would not. They weren't interested. They would be tending to let somebody else take care of it, like a co-op or the state government, or asking the federal government to look at that. And I introduced to them the idea that if we deregulated energy, that would create a competitive arena, and if that did so, that our participation would have a direct impact on lowering or raising the rates as individuals. And it was disturbing to notice how many people would be ignorant, as Amy talked about last week, in terms of the educational environment, that what didn't concern them or what didn't seem to be something that they had a real choice in, they wouldn't get involved in.
Well, you really are triggering my thinking too. In other words, just happen to think that this is one area where people haven't had to shop. In other words, they one company, it is regulated for them, and they look at profits and what, and then they simply pay their bill. And if they have to take on the job of looking at retail, it's interesting to hear your answer that they're not eager to do that, at least in the poll that you took. Is that correct?
Yes. There are people that would be like tigers, and they would be looking at every number, like the man across the table from me, Chris BRAY. But there are people who are like sheep, and that they get led around and they trust. Just like the vocabulary word of bundling, of having a bill that says what your bill is, and it doesn't tell you what it's for. Mm-hmm. And then you just take your check or your money order and you write it out and you say, well, I guess that was worth it because the bottom line was it seemed reasonable, instead of inquiring.
But there'd be a lot of work to do, homework and detail, if you were different companies offering different things. It could become complex. That would lead me to Ken in asking that question. He's someone like yourself who's involved with lots of people in community action. Ken, one of the things that I saw in my research is that it's already happening some, but if we go to a retail business and there's really a lot of companies approaching you, I can imagine the telephone ringing many hours, oftentimes around dinner time, saying, I have for you what is called a one-stop shopping deal. We'll provide your electricity, your natural gas, your telephone service, your internet access, and other things, and here's our package. And I think that's part of what Carolyn was finding with people, that they're concerned having to try to deal with that. Do you think that is something that may happen, or how would citizens approach that option?
Well, actually, I see that as a must. It will happen. It probably will happen with deregulation. All we have to do is think back a short time ago when the telephones were deregulated. And still today, I'm sure we're all getting telephone calls from different telephone companies that are offering us a better deal. And I believe when electrical deregulation is in place, we're going to have the same thing. The one-stop shop may be a good thing if we can define what it is that they're going to offer for us. One of the things that you had mentioned, the senior citizens. A lot of those folks are on fixed incomes, and for the most part, they don't understand what exactly they're being charged for in their utility bill to begin with. So if we could define a one-stop shop and clarify what would be charged for us, then it might make things clearer for us in the future to decide what company to go with.
It's a really interesting point. Yes, Chris?
Tony, in responding a bit to Jerry's and what else was said, if we come forward and have it's easy to build Potlatch. It's a large corporation. Though to be honest and sincere, let me tell you that Potlatch creates 80% of its own utility industry. So it's not a major player in terms of buying or selling its own. I mean, it's producing its own, and therefore the credibility that we feel for Jerry to be on this committee is important. He can speak knowledgeably about the area, but not from a biased standpoint. You give a situation where someone like Simplot or FMC that makes fertilizer in southeast Idaho, if they can purchase 30% of their, or if they are a buyer, and because there's a large volume, they can get a discount. Where is the supplier of energy going to make up that discount? Is that going to be made up from you and me, or is it going to be lost in the system? One of the critical questions are, if the free market allows for some to benefit, how would it allow for all of us to benefit? We don't know the answer to that question. I think the potential for deregulation has already stimulated a great deal of activity, positive activity, by Washington Water Power, by Idaho Power. They're being very creative in trying to find ways to maintain their customer base. They're looking at unbundling their billing package so that you know what you're paying for electricity versus what you're not, which allows you to make some choices. But should we go that further step? That's the question we're asking. Is it in Idaho's best interest to go that next step?
That is a major question. I do want to get in one other area before time is out. It just flies by when we're doing these kind of programs. My research also indicates a term called stranded cost, Chris. And Jerry, you may want to respond to this too. And I want you to explain to the viewers what I mean by stranded cost, and that if there is total deregulation mandated from the national government, and unlike now where it's mandated that there will be so many cents per kilowatt paid to those companies for the cost they put in nuclear power plants, for example, that the only option might be to pass it on to the shareholders, stockholders, and therefore pension plans and other things will be involved. I just want to get this on the table too, because that's something many people may not be thinking about.
I'll speak to it briefly and then yield to Jerry, because he does have some more experience in the area. But a stranded cost would be in the example of, in the present system where we have a monopoly, and the PUC grants to a utility a guaranteed rate of return in exchange for certain specific rates, and guarantees those rates from anybody else coming in competing, but guarantees they won't go higher. In that creation of the rate structure is the cost of doing business. If in the state of Washington, the Whoops project came out to be a bombshell, then their stranded rate includes these costs when they weren't able to in fact pay off all of the poor costs. If we go to now a system of total free market, can they go into the free market without that debt? Do they have to go into the free market and pay that debt to someone else? Those are the sorts of questions in stranded costs that we're looking at, and you and I as an average consumer, I think, don't want to pay for a bad business decision that a company made beforehand, but at the same time they had a monopoly then.
Jerry, would you follow up on that? And also, while you're following up on it, would you indicate, I just gave one option that it might be passed on to the stockholders, but it also might be taken over by the government or whatever. Would you elaborate upon the options?
Sure, and I think that was an excellent example that Chris gave. Basically, it's a cost that market pricing of the generation would not recover. And recall that we are only talking about deregulating the generation. The distribution and transmission will remain the same, regulated monopoly, so it's not like everything's being thrown up in the air. There are only 2 or 3 folks who could possibly pay for any stranded costs, and the popular version of stranded cost is to look at all the generating resources, whether it's hydro that a utility has, take the average cost, not just take the high ones and say they're stranded, but the below ones are okay. Kind of average it, mitigate right down where you can, And then it's either going to be the stockholders, the ratepayers, or some bonding. California has developed, as they are wont to, what they call securitization, where they're selling bonds to pay off these stranded costs. In the final analysis, the ratepayer is going to pay for it one way or the other, or the taxpayer.
Taxpayer, if it goes to the government
Exactly.
to bail them out and so forth.
Exactly.
You have all been excellent, and I appreciate so much your being with us. I have the signal we're right now out of time, but to all the members of the committee here in Idaho, we thank you so much for discussing what I believe is one of the major issues, economic issues facing us, dealing with restructuring of hydroelectric facilities or regulation versus deregulation. And again, I want to remind our viewers, based upon the fact that Congress is debating this, is really escalated this whole debate in each state. But again, I want to recognize the fact that Governor Phil Badd and your committee, along with the Council on Hydroelectric and River Resources he appointed, is really seriously discussing this. And I commend you for traveling the state and getting input from people. And you are a very, very representative committee of the people of our state. And I thank you once again. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found these two programs as informative as I have, and our staff. We have learned a lot about a very, very important issue, and I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week when we will turn to yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.